Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. This is the final session of the Bretton Woods Committee's 2021 annual meeting. All week, we've been discussing how to secure a balanced and sustainable global recovery from COVID-19. And I'm very much looking forward to our final session today with a discussion on green investment and sustainable development. We've kicked off the annual meeting earlier this week with the launch of our new sovereign debt working group and also the release of the working group's introductory paper. We've also had conversations with World Bank President David Malpass and IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva. They discussed some of the issues that we will be discussing here today. And you can find recordings of all of those sessions as well as a copy of that paper on our website. I also want to thank our annual meeting sponsors, SICBA Holdings, Morgan Stanley, and Standard Chartered. Without their generous support, this year's annual meeting would not have been possible, so we thank them. And finally, just a note to our audience that we will, of course, reserve time at the end for audience questions. So if you have a question, we ask that you please submit it by typing it into the Q&A icon in your Zoom toolbar or by submitting it through the chat function. So finally, let me introduce today's speakers. I'm very pleased to introduce them. We have with us Ms. Afsaneh Beschloss, who is the CEO of RockCreek, a leading global investment firm. And before founding RockCreek, she was a partner at the Carlyle Group, and she also served as treasurer and chief investment officer at the World Bank Group, where she led the bank's energy investments and policy advisory work to reduce carbon emissions. Afsaneh also serves on our BWC's board of directors, so we're very delighted to have you with us today, Afsaneh. Thank you. We also have with us Thierry Déau, who is the chairman and CEO of Meridiam, a global investment and asset management firm that specializes in long-term public infrastructure projects. Thierry founded Meridiam in 2005, and he is also the co-founder and chairman of the Long-Term Infrastructure Investors Association. He also serves on our Bretton Woods Committee's board of directors. So thank you, Thierry, for joining us today, and thank you for your leadership on our board. We also have with us Jérôme Haegeli, who is the group chief economist at Swiss Re and co-chair of the advisory council of the World Bank's Global Infrastructure Facility. Jérôme also serves on external committees at the Institute of International Finance and the World Economic Forum. Thank you, Jérôme, for joining us. And finally, we have Aniket Shah, who will be moderating today's conversation. Aniket is a senior fellow and adjunct professor at the Columbia University Center on Sustainable Investment, where he leads research on ESG investment. He also serves on Bretton Woods Committee's advisory council. So we have Bretton Woods Committee leadership well represented today. Appreciate you all being here. Thank you, Aniket, and I will turn it over to you to kick off our conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for the introduction, and thank you to the whole BWC team and the community for the great work to put together these annual meetings. It's really a big accomplishment, and I know many people have found them to be very useful, so thank you. The topic of today's session is the green investment recovery, and our goal is to understand how the investment community is perceiving both the public and private sector's efforts to invest in a recovery that is aligned with sustainable development. To guide us through this complex topic, we are very lucky to have three esteemed leaders from the investment industry whose work I have admired for many years. I guess one of the great things about Bretton Woods committees, you get to meet the people that you have been reading about and following their work. So this is a particular pleasure and privilege for me. Before we begin this group discussion, though, let me make just three high-level comments to help set the context as I see it. The first point that I want to make is that despite significant efforts from both the public and private sectors, the global economy was largely off course from achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement before COVID-19 hit. On many key topics ranging from poverty alleviation in Africa to low carbon infrastructure development in OECD countries, progress was being made, but nowhere close to the pace that was needed to achieve these large ambitions. Let's all remember that CO2 emissions continued to rise after the Paris Agreement was signed, and that national commitments were far away from a 2 degrees Celsius aligned trajectory. So even before COVID hit, there was a lot of discussion in the international policymaking community that we need to actually do things differently if we were to achieve these goals in time. The second point I want to make is that COVID-19 has kickstarted a significant public investment program that has the potential to reorient progress on climate change. We have seen several trillions of dollars of additional public investment that has been made by high income and middle income countries that have the fiscal room to do this. And now the question is, how much of that is oriented towards sustainable development and the green economy? Early estimates from Oxford University show that roughly 20% of the $2 trillion that was announced by the end of 2020 in the 50 largest economies have a green a basis or are aligned to environmental principles. Of course, there are a lot of questions about methodology there. It's a start, but again, we have a long ways to go. And the third point I want to make is that the investor community remains deeply committed to this ESG trend, that's environmental, social, and governance investing, and its cousins, whether it's sustainable investing, impact investing, and so on. There was a big fear of many of us who work in this space that an external shock like a pandemic would mean that the interest in these topics would go away, but I think it's fair to say that the interest has remained, and if anything, has increased. So the investor community is still with us. And now we're going to hear from three people who really know what they're talking about, because they're right in the middle of these topics day in, day out. And I'm going to hand it over to Afsaneh, and then to Thierry, and then to Jérôme, with just an introductory question, which is, how can and how have countries capitalized on the opportunities presented by COVID-19 to transition to a more sustainable economy? And do you think that the effort so far has changed the trajectory of our global efforts on sustainable development? So Afsaneh, let me start with you, and then we can start this discussion. Thank you.
Aniket, thank you so much for that great introduction. And like you, I wanted to thank our friends at Bretton Woods for this great week and very interesting papers. In terms of really everything that you said, Aniket, I can't disagree with anything you said. And I agree, before COVID, we were not on the right trajectory with the broad SDGs and certainly the climate ones. And the US had exited Paris Accord. We had also even China, which had very, very ambitious goals on its solar energy and also renewable energy, in fact, reduce some of those goals. And what you had is a very different kind of trajectory, with countries really looking at carbon emissions in a slightly different way. COVID really impacted us in many ways. Of course, number one, people started not traveling, and movement came to a halt, and manufacturing came to a slowdown. So that meant just generally lower energy use and therefore lower emissions. At the same time, you had a very big trend that happened in the US that's starting to also expand all over the world, which is a little bit, I should say, not a lot, democratization of the investor base. What that meant with Robinhood and other sorts of ways, the youth and a different population entered this investing world. And this particularly new group is much more of, I would say, if you want to call them environmental activists, than the traditional institutional investors had been. So I think that looking into the future is going to be an even more important force, and I'd love to hear from others about that. The third thing I wanted to mention is that while all these negative things are happening, I think that 2 or 3 things that are positive. As you very correctly said, there's a huge amount of resources that are going now being allocated to dealing with COVID. In the US, as we have seen over the last week, President Biden's program is very ambitious when it comes to using green investments as a source of employment, as a source of really restarting the economy here. And I think that that will have a huge impact. And we already are seeing, if we look at EV car purchases in the US or other kinds of indicators, like, if you listen to the speech of Exxon CEO this week again, very different than his speech was a year ago. So I think the world is changing right in front of our eyes. And most importantly, I would say, as you said, SDGs broadly, including energy-related ones that had gone to sort of semi-sleep before COVID, have become very alive. If you look at the returns in funds that were investing in clean energy, in education, in the intersection of technology with education and other SDGs, suddenly much higher returns in post-COVID than anything else. And more funds coming into the market that are oriented towards these areas, because now investors are starting to see these are, in fact, not only high return, but compete very well with traditional investments. And I think we are on a very different trajectory.
Excellent. That's great. Thierry, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And I'll just pick up on a couple of points, maybe three. The first is the pace, and without repeating too much of what Afsaneh said, I think the pace was there, but perhaps not as strong as required in terms of investment in sustainable projects and sustainable companies for the economy. I mean, if what COVID has really created is an acceleration. Somehow, somewhere, we became more aware that we needed to do more. That's one thing. If I take one example of the European Union, for example, I mean, pre-COVID, there was a Juncker plan or European Strategic Fund that mobilized with about 30 billion of public money, 550 billion of investment within the EU, and 40% of that was targeted to transition. And I think the target was actually exceeded. Post-COVID, EU Green Deals, we're talking about nearly, if you take the numbers in multiple ways, between 700 billion and 1 billion just of public money focusing on it, which means that when we leverage that with private investment, we'll reach something which is quite significant at a different scale of what was done pre-COVID, and with a target of 50% in terms of transition. So this is just an example to show our public policies and mobilization has just sort of got into a different gear post-COVID. The other point that I would make is that, let's say pre-COVID, there was a lot of focus on climate as one of the key SDG, and people usually tend to confuse Paris Agreement just with climate. The Paris Agreement is all about the 17 SDG, including climate. And a lot of people before COVID didn't focus on so much on the other ones. And I think the sort of the curbing effect that we've seen from COVID is a real focus on inclusion and social issues. And that really came because, in fact, the whole health sector was totally affected by COVID, and really showed the lack of resilience of our health systems in many, many countries. And the fact that even on the schooling system, there are quite a number of very impactful, negative impactful issues with COVID, with people not being able to access education, and people with less resources not being able to keep their children in the game. So the curbing, which is quite positive, is now we're focusing more on all the other SDGs. That includes the ones that are more about inclusion and social SDGs beyond the environment and climate. And last, I would say that, looking at the multiplication of alliances for net zero from the asset owners, from the intermediaries, the GPs, the banks, and the way regulation is going on non-financial disclosure, which is a real drive for the investor base into this sort of post-COVID world. The issue we'll be facing soon is that, in fact, appetite has been great for quite a long time. Opportunities are not that matching yet the appetite. So there is, on the positive side, a wall of money focused on doing the right thing. But on the other end, there is not quite yet all the opportunities to absorb all that money. So this is an issue both for public policies, but also in the way that the private sector delivers.
Thank you, Thierry. And I'm going to come back to you on this point of absorptive capacity, project preparation, and so on, because it's something that we all know is an issue. And you've been, of course, at the leading edge of trying to figure that out. So we'll come back to that in a second. Thank you. Jérôme, over to you.
Thanks very much, Aniket, and thanks a lot for putting this most important topic into the Bretton Woods Committee program. I definitely think the green investment is the must. It's not just a must, and it's not just a luxury. Fact is, inaction is a real risk. And as I'm sitting here in Zurich, Paris seems to be really far away. I think where we are today is definitely, I think we are definitely behind Paris Agreement if you look at the commitments done by the countries so far. Now, what I'm saying is, yes, the good news, and I share the optimism that there's a lot of positive developments going on, be it in the EU and now especially with the US administration. That's really positive. But still, I think if you look at where we are still missing a lot of action. Aniket, you mentioned before, right, the famous study from Oxford looking at climate change investments. Let me also share the statistic for infrastructure, right? Fact is, in 2020, we have been spending like there is no tomorrow on the fiscal side. It was needed. We are seeing, as we speak today, the greatest fiscal experiment. Especially in the US, and what's more, it's meeting the greatest monetary experiment. We are more used to monetary experiment. The fiscal is a little bit the new thing. It's needed, and it's also an opportunity. But if you look at how much of infrastructure investment out there in the spending, it's really is green. I find it just amazing that it's really just a fraction of what we have been spending during the global financial crisis in 2008. So I think bottom line is also, yes, it's good to spend, but we should definitely invest more in the recovery and invest in the places where you get a lot of positive impacts for growth, and at the same time you improve your trajectory to get to the Paris Agreement. So that would be my point number one. And for the ones who want to have the numbers, I give you the numbers. According to the studies out there, we are spending about $700 billion on green infrastructure investments, and in the global financial crisis, that ratio was much higher, multiple of about 4. Second point I would like to make is, yes, the recovery is here, and the vaccine is not just a shot in the arm; it's also a shot for growth. And hopefully, it has the shot has also that needed ingredients, right, for the climate change adaptability and the investments that we all look for. Second point I wanted to make is, we should also all recognize that this recovery is very, very uneven. And what does that mean in the context of our discussion topic, green investment for recovery? That means, I think, at the end of the day, that we also have to take very, very good care that there are going to be different shades of green across the regions, and not all economies can afford to go green, even if they should. And that's why I think all the topics which are being discussed at spring meetings like debt relief is a huge opportunity to combine the topics of having the necessary fund to fight the human tragedy and the economic crisis, which is leading also to a social crisis, especially in the countries who cannot afford to spend as there is no tomorrow. that we support them also for doing the right investment, and support them doing the right investment in the green area. That's my second point. My third point I would like to make, if you're looking where we are today, and yes, I do represent the insurance sector, you see with the logo up there, and there's a lot that we can do, right? If you're an investor, if you're the insurance sector, we are in the eye of the storm. We are an institutional investor, we are a long-term investor, we transform the risk, and we have the knowledge capital. And I think what is key is when we invest for the recovery, we all work to go together. And I think there's also some sense of positive that the public and the private sector is not just coming together to fight the COVID-19 crisis, but also the COVID opportunities to invest for the future, and to make sure that we have the necessary mass, but we also break down the barriers for investment. So that's why I think the work being done by Thierry and in breaking down barriers for green infrastructure investments, the work being done by the Global Infrastructure Facility in doing putting out the label of what is sustainable is super paramount, because fact is we still have too little of sustainable investments out there. We're close here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jérôme. That's very helpful, and particularly the perspective of insurance investors who are perhaps the longest term investors that we have. Hearing your perspectives on infrastructure is key. Let's talk about this topic of sustainable infrastructure in a little bit more detail. Thierry, one of the points that you made is that there is this wall of money, so to speak, looking for things to invest in. Perhaps those of us who are proselytizing to the investor community have done too good of a job getting the investors primed. But we don't understand yet the other side of it, which is how do you get more projects for this money to go into? So perhaps I will start with you and then hand it over to Afsaneh and then Jérôme again. But give us a sense about this mismatch of the supply of capital versus the demand. Obviously, there is a latent demand for more green things, more green infrastructure. Why are we not able to crack this nut as a global economy to have more places for this private capital to go to? What's holding us back?
Thanks. First of all, I think it's important to notice that from nearly 10 years ago, where asset owners used to have allocation for the infrastructure asset class of around, in average, 2%, I think the average may exceed 5% by now. And some of the large ones today have 10% or even 20% in their portfolio for real assets like infrastructure. So and so that represents billions and sometimes trillions. What we're really facing is really the pipe to create these infrastructures and these projects. This is a topic that at the level of the financial institutions, the global one, the World Bank and the IFCs and the G20 through the Global Infrastructure Hub. Infrastructure has been a topic since the Australia G20, or perhaps even the Russian one. And it's a topic every year. However, we are still struggling because project preparation is actually well funded, but not well skilled. In fact, when I had my discussion when Maktar became the CEO of IFC, it was the same discussion I had with his predecessor. His question is, how can you help me grow my people so I can deploy more on the upstream? And which is really helping government prepare, focus, strategize, and deliver their sort of public procurement to address the infrastructure needs in a speedy way, in the most standardized way possible, so the financial institutions can actually address it with volumes, because there's always an issue of volume and an issue of understanding risk. And so that is, I mean, there are multiple, and I think we've moved along over the past 5 years quite a lot. If I take a couple initiatives like the blended finance initiative, where all the multilaterals have been involved, and great report from the OECD, and I think we all try to implement, which is how to de-risk and how to standardize as much as possible, and how to bring in and mobilize more private capital into more projects, because the projects are better structured. That's one. There's one, the G20 through the Global Infrastructure Hub, the French government and ourselves launched a fellowship for public servants that are dedicated to procurement of infrastructure, to really jumpstart them into really understanding what are the risk and reward in engaging in private sector, and how important that initial strategic preparation piece is into unlocking the investment. And, you know, it's going from 5 years of development for large projects that can bring huge benefit to make it 1 or 2 years. So we're not quite yet there, but it's coming. So it requires, really, the issue is not money. The issue is skills. So collectively, both on the investment side and the public side, we do need to figure out how to accelerate careers and skills in delivering these projects, because one thing is it's not an asset class which is as easy as everything else, where you can just standardize, package, and wholesale. You know, it's not real estate. And because you have, it's very diverse. You go from green energy to your local BRT for clean mobility, to something to your hospital. All of these just don't fit in the same box and require sort of slightly different skills to deliver. So this is the challenge in front of us. I think a lot of us, you know, there's even a great report from the G20 Eminent Person Group on the topic already nearly 5 years ago. All the solutions are there. It's really about how do we mobilize people to grow that bit, which is the bottleneck.
Great. That's very helpful. Afsaneh, do you agree with that?
No, I agree that there are resources sitting there to invest, and we need a lot of skill. And I completely agree that what happened on the infrastructure and particularly clean energy side is, I remember when I started my career on energy, which was at the World Bank, and before that, you know, at Oxford. And it was really about the oil and gas when we were starting to get into renewables. And the skills were obviously more on oil and gas. And when we created this sort of investment group at the bank to do solar, wind, some of the skills came from oil and gas, but some of the skills came from other areas. To me, the World Bank was doing so much in infrastructure, other multilaterals similarly. This is like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And those of us who are familiar with these institutions, the multilaterals, the Bretton Woods institutions, are very familiar with the fact that there were leaders in infrastructure. And they would take the lessons that Thierry was talking about in one place. And obviously you can't apply the same lesson to every place, but often the skills that you had created would be used in multiple places. So I remember going to China early on, where they wanted to have the people who had done the best projects across the globe come and help them in building some of their infrastructure. And they were very smart in finding those in our team who had had more years. And they would say, I want Thierry and I want Jérôme and I want Aniket, you know, chose the people specifically. So there was a time where we were actually doing this. So why are we not taking the World Bank and other multilaterals and being ambitious again and saying this is the place where exactly the things that Thierry just listed for us should be centered, and the bank should go to part of its original mission to be a green bank, to be you know, an engine of growth, not just in terms of capital, but one mobilizing capital. Because I agree with Thierry that there is capital on the sidelines. I also disagree a little bit because I think a lot more capital could be generated, and it is demand and supply sort of help each other. And so if the bank could help mobilize resources, connect, what Jérôme has been working, Thierry has been working, you've been working, Aniket, myself, many others in this area, both in terms of public, private, and financial sector, and then also come up with these best cases and helping to create the skills that we just talked about. I think it would be huge. The second thing, again, Thierry put his hand on is real estate has benchmarks. So if I have real estate in my portfolio, I can say I did better or worse than, and a lot of institutional investors, unlike retail investors, need benchmarks, right? We don't have benchmarks for infrastructure. And I agree, it's lots of different categories, but we could come up, maybe the four of us on this session, with some simple benchmarks for these kinds of investments. So I think that is a second thing that is really, really important and needs attention. But I really do believe that there is still need for more resources to come in here, because when we talk about resources, infrastructure is one part of it. Services and people who, it used to be the services and the consultants were also very important. And guess what happened? Over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of people who were in those professions got out of it because green energy was not growing sufficiently, right? I was at Shell when I first went, this is a while back, quite a few years ago. I took a year off from the World Bank to sit on Shell's group planning, which is their scenario planning group. And I remember when I came back to the World Bank, they closed down their renewable energy group that we had hired from, in fact. So a lot of cycles have gone through. So we need to create the skills. We need to use the skills we have. We need to use the multilateral institutions in a smart way. And especially now with technology, I think we could come up with better, smarter ways of conveying the sorts of things that Thierry talked about. And then last but not least, it's not just infrastructure. There are the public companies that are also involved in this whole chain. There are a lot of startups. There's a lot of venture money that is again starting to go. Some of the largest shares of venture and early stage investments is going back into clean energy and water and other areas that we've been talking about. And I think we need to look at it holistically as A to Z.
I think we might have lost
Aniket, did we lose you?
So Jérôme, you probably want to kick in right there.
Thank you for that. Thierry, you mentioned before that the role of the money is not a problem of the money. Afsaneh, you mentioned supply and demand issue. I think you're both right. Let me add a little bit. I think where we are today and what is really needed. And yes, Thierry, I think you were spot on, right? 2014 was the Australia G20 meeting. They came after the Russian G20 meeting in St. Petersburg, who put infrastructure as an asset class for the first time on the G20 priority work stream. And here, after so many years, it's still a top priority. And I continue to believe it is right that it is a top priority, and yes, that we haven't moved further along in terms of getting to the success. I think it's also due to what you said, Thierry. It's very difficult, fragmented, yet to be built asset class. Fact is, it's not a tradable asset class. And I think that is really key to recognize. It's not a tradable asset class. And that's why I think it's really important that the MDBs and the private sector, they all work together. Yes, we do have some fantastic initiatives out there. The Global Infrastructure Hub, which was established just after the G20 Australia presidency. It's really important. We have the Global Infrastructure Facility, and they have done tremendous work providing lots of project programs, 100 infrastructure programs that the GIF has put in place in nearly 50 countries. And what's more important, they have brought in the private sector. I think for me, and also thinking about the insurance sector more generally, yes, we have a lot of interest to invest more funds in infrastructure debt, because it's long term, because it's good risk-adjusted returns for similar ratings if you compare it to the corporate credit. But fact is, for small and mid-sized insurance companies, it remains very hard to access high transaction fees. And second, I think fact is, in a world which has become more risky because of fragmentations, because of where we are today with after COVID-19, investor creditor rights, I think we need to take very good care of investor creditor rights. And there again, I think the tradability and improving tradability of infrastructure debt remains paramount. So that's why I think all efforts need to be geared at making sure that we improve the tradability. We have some common template in terms of disclosure, as well as monitoring mechanism, and that the template is a shared one between the public and the private sector. And maybe now the US initiative provides some upside, because the US is ready to deploy more funds, because what is needed is to have this gold standard, it's to have the benchmark that you, Afsaneh, have been speaking about. We need to have some benchmark, but without having a gold standard, we're not going to get the benchmark. So standardization for me is really at the forefront. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And sorry, my internet went out, but I'm back. I think the infrastructure gods were so excited about the conversation that they needed me to get off the line. But look, I want to ask one more question about this infrastructure topic because of the three of your expertise, and it is so central to this whole green recovery. One of the messages out there in the market is that Thierry, there may be a wall of debt capital out there, but there isn't enough equity capital meaning there are not enough investors are willing to take risk, the high upfront risk to get an infrastructure project going, particularly in quote unquote emerging or low income countries. I want you to reflect on that, because I want the participants in this conference to understand if there really is enough capital, or do we need a specific type of capital which will unlock all of this other money that is sitting there. So again, maybe I'll just start with you, and then we'll go through the same order. And Jérôme, sorry I missed your earlier comments, but if you could then speak to how the infrastructure investor world is thinking about debt versus equity in your response in allocation, that would be very helpful. So again, Thierry, then Afsaneh, and then Jérôme.
You kind of opened a big Pandora box, but let me try to address it because this is a really critical topic. I mean, the positive side is I don't believe that there is a lack of equity, or actually when investors look at emerging markets, it's sometimes easier for them to think of it in terms of equity rather than debt, because risk rewards sometimes are more manageable from an equity perspective because of the sometimes sort of overall negative impression that they have of country risk in those regions. So it's not a given that they would prefer debt. From the supply perspective, I don't like to talk about myself, but I only do equity, and I can assure you that every fund we close, we are oversubscribed by 4 times, and I have to cap it. And that includes our funds for Africa. And so there is no shortage or lack of demand on the equity side. It's true that the debt volumes are much bigger, but that's sort of normal because the debt portion tends to come from away from the fixed income pocket that used to be huge in all these institutions and no longer providing any return. So therefore, it's moving towards a better asset class. But clearly, it is not my experience that the equity is really missing. So, but it brings me back to the point of blended finance, risk sharing, risk protection. You know, when you invest in these low-income country, which we do in places like Madagascar, or we do work with the DFIs, we do use the MIGA, PRI, and contractual breach protection. And these are great instruments to actually provide investors with the risk reward that is necessary for them to invest in there. So, but again, it's a little bit more work than just throwing money at it. So you do have to make it happen. And it comes back to the structuring skills and to the ability to do that. That's just one comment on the benchmark, because there's also some hope. In some places, you know, the EDEC Infra in Singapore has started about 5 or 6 years ago, you know, creating a benchmark for unlisted infrastructure. The reality is, unless all of us investors provide data, we won't have a benchmark that is actually working. So this is a bit of a chicken and egg, but it's coming. It's also a new asset class, so having enough reliable, good data to create a benchmark is not necessarily something that comes into the first 20 years. Maybe we have to wait for another 5, but there is some hope there.
Aniket, if I could jump in, I think completely agree with everything Thierry said. But also, let's remember, if we look again at early stage investments and you know, venture and growth, that's all equity. Then if we come to development projects, as Thierry said, if you look at it, let's not forget IFC, World Bank, the DFC here in the US, a lot of DFIs do, as you said, not have, have been sort of traditionally often doing more debt than equity. And I think they're realizing that they do need to change that share. That doesn't preclude the fact that, as Thierry said, whether, in his work, in our work at RockCreek, or, in others, a lot of equity is getting raised in sort of private, shape of private infrastructure equity. But at the same time, no question that the DFI model was very much debt and credit. So the fact that they have not, they used to, again, going back historically, not to be the historian here, originally they were providing equity and then they started doing debt and credit. And I have no idea why they stopped providing, they sort of assumed that that part would be covered. And as you said, it's not completely covered. So no question that, if we had one advice probably for the DFIs, I would say do provide all parts of the capital structure. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I also look forward to hearing from Jérôme is, we also had this great paper that that Bretton Woods just did and put out earlier this week on debt, which I recommend to everyone to read. But the whole subject of a debt restructuring and putting that together with some sort of a debt for a climate swap, or it doesn't have to be debt for climate specifically swap structure, but some sort of structure that uses more innovative financial structures to reduce particularly debt in the lowest income countries and encourages whatever they were going to pay in debt service into green projects directly will be a win-win versus forcing them to not be able to pay the debt or continue on conditionality to institutions that actually makes climate worse. So being smart about this huge amount of debt overhang for for the lowest income countries and moving that into some sort of a climate related positive repayments structure through swaps or other means would be really smart, I think.
Maybe to build on that, and thanks also for raising Afsaneh in terms of the paper out there, super paper from the Bretton Woods committee on the debt. Maybe picking up that first, I totally agree with you. I think the SSI initiative, for me, it's a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity to bring the two together the SSI initiative as well as the Paris Agreement. And I think in the Paris Agreement, we shouldn't forget, we have an Article 9. And in Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, it states that the Green Climate Fund, which was established in 2010, that will need to be, countries will need to raise money and actually contribute to that fund. And they have pledged $100 billion starting 2025. That's not so far away, right? 2025. And fact is, so far the annual pledges are only 10.2 billion, so far from the pledges. Well, we still have some time until 2025, but I think it would have been a great opportunity to marry the DSSI initiative also to provide not just a debt stop, because it's not a debt relief, it's no, it's net present value neutral in terms of debt, DSSI, we shouldn't forget that. Doesn't improve debt sustainability, but we could have an opportunity to improve debt sustainability and combine the need to provide funds and fiscal space to fight COVID-19, as well as provide the fiscal buffer which is being created if you really do debt relief to spend on green investment. Because fact is, there are lots of different shades of green in terms of potential for greening the recovery, and what's more, as mentioned before, obviously the recovery is and remains very uneven. So yes, absolutely, I think there's a huge opportunity in terms of action on this front. Last point, you also asked me, Aniket, to comment on debt versus equity for infrastructure from an investor or insurance perspective. Well, first, from an insurance sector perspective, the insurance sector is working on the asset liability matching principles, meaning they are very long-term liabilities. That's why for an insurance sector, which makes up about 1/3 of the long-term investment community out there, it's quite big. If you look at numbers, the insurance sector is around 30 trillion, 25 to 30 trillion dollars of assets under management, of the full 80 trillion assets under management from the long-term investment space. So for the insurance sector, definitely there's a huge interest and attractiveness for the debt, because you can match the liabilities. But yes, definitely need the equity as well, no question about that. Fact is, however, also if you move down, that's my last comment, if you move down or if you move up the credit risk spectrum, and if you look at emerging market infrastructure investments, fact is, less than 1% of the infrastructure investment in the emerging market space is being financed by foreign institutional investors, and bank loans are the main form of investments. So that just gives you a sense of how a global institutional investor space would look at it, and yes, huge opportunity to what you mentioned, Afsaneh, and thanks for mentioning. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to take the conversation in a slightly different direction, and then we're going to come back to, at the end, some discussions around what the Bretton Woods organizations need to do to get this right. And I think Afsaneh has given us a lot of good ideas to start that. But let's put a pin on that and come back to that in 10 minutes. One of the conversations I'm hearing a lot from leaders in the investment industry is that this whole push towards net zero, in quotes, could have some real adverse impacts for low-income and middle-income countries. And the idea, of course, being that low-income and middle-income countries many of them have significant fossil fuel reserves, and or they have significant fossil fuel usage in their energy system. They are much poorer, obviously, than high-income countries, and their historical contributions to climate change have been much less than that of the high-income world. And therefore, a focus on net zero for investment managers and asset owners could have a deleterious impact on these countries, because it would force asset managers to pull money out of countries that have higher fossil fuel usage and into places that are able to transition because they are wealthier countries, so to speak. And there's a lot in that question, whether these trade-offs are real and so on and so forth. But I want to marry this the ESG net zero world with the whole concept of a just transition and the fate of low and middle income countries and their efforts for sustainable development and the Paris Agreement, and just get your reactions to whether you see there being a tension there and what are some ways to solve it. And Jérôme, because I've allowed you to go third in the first couple of questions, I'm now going to ask you to just give us some of your thoughts first, and then I'll hand it over to Afsaneh and then to Thierry.
Thanks a lot. I mean, you asked first, Aniket, what can Bretton Woods institutions do? And here, I'm very happy to hear that the IMF is now including in its Article 4 consultations, also tracking how well our country is doing relative to Paris Agreement. That's super important. And I thank the IMF for doing this and starting to do that. Second, you mentioned what can we do now that lower income countries have to spend, have also get net zero, but maybe cannot afford to do so. And the fact is, if you look at the fossil fuel out there, a lot will stay, right? In terms of oil, will stay below the ground. And that's definitely not easy in terms of the adjustments. And that's why I think it's super important to think about debt for climate swaps. That's why I mentioned what I mentioned before, the DSSI framework. Yes, it's a start. DSSI framework, however, is not debt relief. It's not. It just provides standstill, but not debt relief. I think there's a huge opportunity here for the Bretton Woods institutions to think and marry with the Paris Agreement. Why Paris Agreement? Because Paris Agreement, you have Article 9, and Article 9 states that there needs to be a transfer from the developed to the developing countries starting 2025 of $100 billion. Huge. That's quite a huge number, $100 billion, because it's on a yearly basis. And I think that's the opportunity, the debt for the climate swaps and marrying it together with the Paris Agreement, while being very clear in terms of transparency, providing the transparency, how well our country is doing with respect to the Paris Agreement, and reporting that. And maybe one last point, when reporting what countries are doing relative to the Paris Agreement, that just raises the transparency, and that improves the disclosure, and then allows the investor as well to better price it in the sovereign risk, because at the end of the day, climate change is systemic risk. That's why we need to have more transparency and disclosure. Thank you.
Great. Afsaneh, your thoughts?
So Aniket, maybe I'll divide up my comments to two parts. One is sort of, you mentioned on the Bretton Woods institutions. So
let's come back to the Bretton Woods. Let's use in the last few minutes.
Absolutely. We'll come back to that. But in terms of agree completely with what Jérôme said. If you think about it, when, we've signed up for net zero, let's say at RockCreek, as many others. So what does that mean? I think it's really twofold. One is everybody who has signed up has to make sure their own behavior, right? How much do we fly? How do we fly? How do you transport yourself? Do you use plastics in your office? Which, by the way, with COVID-19, all of a sudden we had a huge setback, right? Which has not been particularly measured. So one is, when you say net zero, what are you doing yourself, right? It's like there's all these conversations always about diversity and people, asset managers lecturing other people. So what are you doing in your own house? The second thing is more important, obviously, but human behavior leverages itself in positive and negative ways, as we have seen from a lot of studies. The net zero could be exactly as Jérôme said, done in a relative basis. Where are the largest, right, emitters? And for example, when you talk about emerging markets, there is, let's say, China, because a lot of the goods that are produced in China have a high level of carbon emission, right, on a percentage basis, and particularly because a lot of the G7 pushed their production of manufacturing of certain goods to China and neighboring countries, it means that by definition, they're also they're producing goods that are high in carbon emission. Two, they are using coal. Therefore, you're even doubling that. So when we talk about going to net zero, what are you doing? Where's the biggest bang for the buck? Which is exactly brings us to what Jérôme said, which is when you come to the lowest income country, that's where you need the transfer, because we know in a realistic world, there is some energy transition. You can't go from, what we're consuming today to suddenly tomorrow not having gas in cars, right? I mean, that's going to take 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever years. So in that transition, some gasoline needs to get used, some diesel needs to get used, some, airplanes need fuel, whatever. So that could be coming from the poorest countries, right? So in the form of transfer, if they happen to be energy producing, if the other commodity producers happen to be in these countries, again, how do you make some sort of more of an equality of production quotas, so that the richer countries have to kind of, as it were, subsidize the poorer countries, and maybe use some of the tools of the Paris Accord or other ones to make this realistic. So I think there's so many tools that exist, as Jérôme said. How can we use them and apply them and implement them?
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Thierry.
Briefly, because I don't want to, because I fully support what Afsaneh just said. I think one thing that we do need to acknowledge the fact that these low-income countries are actually, they're probably less responsible for the disaster. So therefore, I don't think we should standardize the effort. And I think the Paris Agreement, by discussing the transfer of money that was necessary for them to make this effort, was sort of acknowledging that. But what we should also acknowledge is that since they are facing their own industrialization and growth, beyond money, they also need a little bit of leeway compared to us. And the danger that I see is that in our own regulation in the Western world or the Northern world, whatever you want to call it, we tend to be absolute and apply all the rules the same way all over. And I will, it's true in the US, it's true within the EU, when all the institutions that do development in the EU, like the EIB or some of the national institutions, just apply without any distinction the sort of targets of the EU to countries in Africa. It becomes totally incomprehensible. We need to support a just transition, and that means that when a country like Senegal, that is producing 70% of its electricity with heavy fuel, finds gas, we need to be able to finance their gas industry, because it is better than heavy fuel. And so unless we look at it as a transition and we can agree on what sort of energies are transition energy, and gas is one, you can have a debate on whether nuclear is one. Being French, I do believe it is one. But so we have to be realistic, because these countries, and to be realistic, we have to take into account the other SDGs. Access to a decent income in those countries is part of the goal. It's not all about saving the planet and asking them the same effort that we're asking the big polluters like the US and the Europe and many of those. I'll keep China out of this debate because I don't want to get in there. But but it's quite important that the just transition sort of trickles down into the way the regulators also see investment in those countries. Because unfortunately, the regulation today applies to where you're from in terms of the investor or the development bank. And you're supposed to apply this across the world regardless of what you do. And that is a very dangerous path. And I can already see the negative impact of it in many of the policies from the DFIs, as Afsaneh was saying, that are critical in this transition.
Absolutely. You know, I did my doctorate in economic geography because I always believe that you have to think about economic development in a contextual way. And it's quite remarkable to see in the highest levels of policymaking on this topic our utter lack of a geographical context of our thinking. It's quite stunning, actually, our lack of a framework to think about these things. And it's having very real impacts right now, as we all know, in the ability of low-income countries to finance themselves, to get private capital and so on, at a time when capital flows are, for other reasons, re-domesticating. So this is a big issue. This is a big issue for us to think about at Bretton Woods Committee going forward. Let me ask now my last question before we go into Q&A, and we already have a wonderful set of questions. We've had many comments from all of you about the World Bank and its evolution. Afsaneh has given us some great perspective on some of the challenges, some of the maybe going back to some core efforts of the World Bank in the past. Jérôme spoke about the IMF and some of the evolution in their thinking on climate when it comes to their Article 4 consultations. Obviously, the IMF is taking a bigger and bigger, having a bigger voice on climate change in general, which is nice to see. And their leadership on that issue is quite remarkable. What do you think are the 2 or 3 things that the Bretton Woods organizations need to do differently over the next 10 years for us to have a shot at mobilizing more public and private capital for a green investment program globally? If you could wave your magic wand for these institutions, what would you ask for? And perhaps that can be the basis of the work that we think about going forward on this topic for BWC. So Afsaneh, maybe I'll start with you, then Jérôme, and then Thierry, and then I think we'll open it up to Q&A right after.
So I think that's such a great question, Aniket, and so many directions we can talk about. One that I think matters is to say, for example, again, looking at Bretton Woods institutions, let's take the World Bank, originally set up to help institutions after World War II, right? Europe and Japan to reconstruct, did a great job of that. Once that was done, then created a new mission, which was to help emerging markets, by the way, particularly in infrastructure, among other things. So if we were starting a World Bank today from scratch, what should it be doing? I think it's kind of straightforward from what we've been talking about, and COVID has made it even more visible. It is, how do we move towards the SDGs in a more equitable and much faster way? And so how do you do that with today's structure of the capital markets and where financial world is moving towards, is to use the World Bank as this new infrastructure or new climate or new green bank, which again, we can come up with the details, but it will be, number one, orienting towards a lot of the things we talked about earlier today, the building of infrastructure in the countries, learning from examples in one to share with the others, becoming truly a multilateral organization that is working very closely with other multilaterals, and very importantly, with the private sector. It is so important to work with groups like with Thierry, like with Jérôme, like with others. There's so much happening on the insurance world that shows us that these risks are huge and really important. And then the third thing I think that is really, really important for multilaterals, and I'll just talk about the World Bank because I happen to know its finances better, is right now, even today, it could borrow more and lend more. Either can already borrow under its existing facilities. It can be lending a lot more, we talked about equity, into getting a lot of the projects that are needed to make the greener investments. But then we know every dollar that the World Bank invests has a huge leverage effect if you can get it to work together with the private sector and with the financial sector into 10, 20 times leverage. So that could be by itself huge. And of course, you can go on to get more resources for the World Bank from the government. But the same thing goes, you know, and as you said, IMF has been in the leadership on this, and there's no reason that the other multilaterals could not be doing similar things.
You know, I'm sorry, I'm going to just ask a follow-up to that, because we have the former treasurer of the World Bank with us. So this question of increasing the balance sheet of the World Bank is one that is just fascinating to me, because we know even the credit rating agencies have been saying you can do more if you wanted to, and it won't affect your credit rating. Give us just 30 seconds more about what is stopping that from happening.
Really good question. I think a lot of their efforts at the World Bank, and for very good reason, has been towards getting the next replenishment and the next replenishment. You know, it was the case when I was there. It has become more of the case today. But I think people have forgotten the nexus. I think a lot of people who have been in the World Bank have sort of forgotten, one, the history, two, its strengths, three, its financial structure. As you correctly said, Aniket, right now the leverage might be around, depending on the day, 4.5 times. It was a time where the leverage was maybe 7 to 8 times. And as you said, the rating agencies were just fine, right? So it has always been, a part of my old job was to work with the rating agencies to get, you know, to maintain the AAA rating of the bank. And no one is saying lose the AAA rating, but within that AAA rated credit, you can certainly gradually, with education, with working together with your you know, people who are buying your bonds and the rating agencies, move from, you know, going from 4 to 7 or 8, that's already doubling. Now, if you wanted to go beyond that with today's financial structure and study that, we can all, you know, get together on a different session and talk about that, but you can already make a lot of impact. And by the way, IDA can borrow, which is huge.
Absolutely. There's your impact investment right there. Just buy the bonds of IDA and let them get that money to poor countries. No, that's great. Jérôme, some thoughts from you about where we should take the Bretton Woods organizations next.
Absolutely. No, thanks a lot. Super question. I mentioned before, transparency, disclosure, super important in order to price. Why do I say in order to price? Because there's no way around bringing in private markets. Bretton Woods Solutions is all about the public sector, right? Into multilateral development banks, huge opportunity. Let me tell you where I see it. First, I mentioned the Article 4 consultations. That increases transparency. I think the next step is bring in the risk of climate inaction into the forecasts. I would like to see the world where the IMF is also doing its debt sustainability analysis, bringing in the failure of inaction into their debt sustainability analysis. That would be the next step. Bring in into the economic forecast failure or progress of action, because then you really start pricing it in. So that's on the forecast. Second, what I can do more, I think also on the program. I mentioned marrying DSSI 2.0 with Paris Agreement. Another way to say it is we should be thinking about new programs at the IMF as well as the World Bank. If we all believe, and there is a strong consensus, that climate risk is systemic risk, where are the programs that look for conditionality of how we spend the proceeds from debt relief or from new money being received from the Bretton Woods solution? So I think we should see also better and clearer targeted conditionality towards the green recovery and climate change. And it's not negative for growth, quite the contrary. We all know that the green infrastructure investments, it has a bigger multiplier than if it's not a green infrastructure investment, and hence it's actually even positive for growth. Third, and then I will stop, Bretton Woods institutions, huge opportunity, and I think the G20 Eminent Persons Group report out a few years ago also said it and showed it. Bretton Woods institutions, they can accelerate funds from the private sector, they can bring in the private sectors. I think whatever they do in terms of the rule setting, they should do it together. And that's why I think on the infrastructure side, huge upside and opportunity from the Bretton Woods institutions to work together. If you have a car and are driving along the highways, You don't want to have different traffic signs. You need to have a uniform traffic signs. And that's why I think also multilateral development banks need to work together in figuring out what set of standardization is needed so that infrastructure that becomes a tradable asset class. And here, once again, I just want to refer to the work being done by the Global Infrastructure Facility, because I think the fast infra is an important one. The finance to accelerate the sustainable transition infrastructure work stream. Also, it's work being done with the public sector and the private sector. And that's what it's all about. So using the power of the public and private sector to work together on the rules and standardization, because what we need is a tradable asset class. Thank you.
Excellent. That's a very helpful and very actionable set of ideas. Thank you, Jérôme. Thierry, over to you.
Briefly, because I think we need to leave room for those many questions that are popping up. I think first at the level of governance and strategy, let's be real, all the Treasury's representative that sits on those boards are more risk averse than anybody else. So that needs to change. These institutions have board of directors that are forgetting sometimes the mission, and the risk averse and obsession with the AAA, and not saying that they should abandon it, has become a bit of a dogma and a mantra that really impairs the ability of those institutions to deliver their mission. And I think that needs to change. It needs to change with more transparency on the measurement of the impact of this mission, because there's not enough data available for accountability of these institutions towards the public in terms of what impact did they really have. And the last on this governance is, I believe that mobilization beyond their own funds of private sector should be a clear objective and performance indicator of these institutions. And unless this is done, they will still live in their own world and not necessarily reach out to the private sector available capital flow, because it is now measured, I shouldn't say that, but it's measured on a voluntary basis and not sanctioned positively or negatively by the board at one point. So there are a number of simple things also that have been discussed and for many reasons are not being done. You know, you could create a debt asset class in infrastructure in emerging market by securitizing quite a lot of the portfolios of these institutions. And that will actually be able to give you a benchmark fairly quickly, because perhaps people rather buy a securitized product of the IDA investment rather than buying AAA bonds from IDA, because not the same returns, not the same impact for the investors. The other thing is the focus on the upstream, build skills, and that is fundamental, because and that's also comes with the risk aversion, but that needs to go. The upstream is the most important. And last, I will mention, because we always forget that they're part of the Bretton Woods, but the WTO will definitely need to include in the discussions on, border transition, carbon taxes, or things like that, the goal of climate into trade, because it is one of the big things that emerging economies, but also the developed economies are using as a tool to develop. So,
great. Wow. Thank you. Really helpful. Well, Emily, let me hand it to you, and you can guide us through the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you, Aniket, and thank you to our panelists. I don't think we could have asked for a better set of speakers to talk about this topic. I have learned a lot, and we do have a lot of questions, so I want to get to a few of those. So first I'll go to Whitney Debevoise, and I'll just ask that you please identify yourself to the panel when you pose your question. Whitney, are you there? Whitney's having a little trouble with his audio. I'm going to read his question. Whitney says, some ESG bonds seem to be sold at a premium. Is this justified, particularly in these early days of the market when issuers look around and say we already qualify, so let's sell an ESG bond? In other words, the issuers are not really making any new ESG commitment. and the financial risk for the bond purchaser is the same as before. So maybe Afsaneh, we'll go to you on that one first.
Sure. So, you know, I think the big topic that comes up when it comes to the to anything that is related to the broad category of green bonds has been whether they're getting truly used in appropriate ways, in impactful investments, right? The secondary question is, you know, the price at which they're getting sold, right? There is no question that there is an increasing market, broadly speaking. There is, you know, green bonds, there's social bonds. Now there is, we just, at RockCreek just did a bond issue with the World Bank with the gender lens. So there's no question that investors in the marketplace are looking for certain mission-oriented kinds of returns. And so, you know, you may find that they're willing to not need the same return for the bonds. There was also a very big discussion around the recent, you know, bond issue discussion that BlackRock brought to the market this week. And again, similar topics, I think. So excellent question. I don't think there is a right or wrong. You know, the market is sort of setting these prices, not, you know, generally because of supply and demand. And maybe as this, you know, even if today, Emily, you wanted to have a portfolio of just, let's say, green bonds, the supply, you know, it's growing, but it's not huge compared to the total size of the bond market. It's tiny, in fact. And maybe there is that element also that is driving its price and its yield to where it is today. But I think as it gets to be a bigger place, as it's proving that it is in fact getting used in truly green and impactful ways rather than just marketing ways, I think it will be interesting to watch those yields.
And maybe a follow-up question here. I think Thierry commented on this earlier, but you know, what role is regulatory fragmentation playing in this, you know, market uptake of green bonds and these other types of bonds? Thierry, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to the regulatory in terms of the rules, in terms of issuing green bonds, but I think we've got to a better place on green bonds, but not yet on the other type of bonds, the SDG bonds and all of us. And this whole mismatch of supply and demand is what's creating this sort of distortion on premium, but it's not a systematic one. So I don't think we should much worry about it. There is a good trend in terms of regulation to have sort of a common acceptable number of standards to qualify those bonds. The green ones, I think we're quite clear. The SDG ones, it's work in progress. I mean, we just issued an SDG bond for the Fresno University 2 months ago. I didn't have any premium. So it's work in progress. Give it another year or so, but it also brings back to the benchmark issues and the standardization of the regulation.
And Jérôme, do you want to jump in here, or I can go to another audience question?
No, I think Thierry and Afsaneh covered a lot of ground. Fact is, it's still a small market, but it's growing, and that's a good thing. And definitely, maybe just one point: sustainability standards board initiative for the IOSCO and the IFRS. I think that's an important one because you need to have a shared taxonomy. Once you have a shared taxonomy, you're going to get a bigger market out there. And now, fact is, sustainability debt or green bonds, it's about 2%, right, of the outstanding bonds, and that's too small for what it should be. Yeah, stop here.
Thanks, Jérôme. I'm going to go now to Delphine Tutu. Delphine, would you please identify yourself and pose your question?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking my question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello. So I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm working with the global news agency AFP. I would like to come back on the idea of connecting the debt relief to the green investments for poor countries. I have a specific question about how can the international institutions can guarantee concretely that the money saved will go to these types of of investments. Behind this question is, of course, the question and the issue of corruption in some countries. So this is a smart idea, but how can you make sure that it will be implemented in those countries?
Thanks. Jerome, do you want to maybe take a stab at that one first?
Very happy to do. And thanks very much, Delphine, for asking the excellent question. Well, the private sector involvement, that's the G20 common framework, right, which is an evolution of the DSSI, which has been put into place during COVID-19, during COVID emergency last year. I think what is really important is that you have a monitoring of Bretton Woods institutions of how they use any proceeds, if they have any proceeds, right, from the debt restructuring, because the SSI just provides you a standstill so that you can spend on the needs to fight the humanitarian crisis, to fight the COVID crisis, but you don't get funds yet just by having the standstill in terms of not paying the payments for green investments. What I mentioned before, the SSI 3.0, if I can call it like that, marrying the SSI with Paris Agreement, the Article 9, that would be something new, and that would necessitate, no question, that you have conditionality, and you need to have conditionality in such a program by the IMF and the World Bank, that if they get debt relief in addition to not paying debt under the SI, really get debt relief, so net present value decrease of the debt, that this is being spent into green into the green economy for green investments. That is doable, but first of all, you need to get net present value reduction of the debt, so you really need to get real debt restructuring. That's not what you get so far on the DSSI, but you could get it if you would go a step further. I think you would need to get a step further, no question about that. And then the question here is of conditionality and monitoring of the IMF and the World Bank. They would show also then that where possible and where it is part of the program, that the private sector also is part of the envelope. Yeah, I stop here. Thank you.
Afsaneh, Thierry, any follow-up to Jerome's comments?
I was just going to add that the primary responsibility, though, on this debt relief is between the countries that are on both sides. That partnership needs to be clear and built, and debt relief should clearly have conditionalities. There's a lot of politeness about this topic, and I think we have to stop that and create real, true partnership where people get debt relief with real investment projects that will benefit from that debt relief, either strategic sector and then we can have the DFIs help implement or monitor. But the primary responsibility is the one of a state that gets the debt relief, and those states or Paris Club or whoever that provide the debt relief to be fairly clear on the conditionality. It's a question of full responsibility from those governments on both sides first. But I don't disagree with anything Jérôme said.
I also agree with both Thierry and Jérôme on everything they said. So just one additional point, I think, is while we're talking about the stock of debt, because debt relief is for your stock of debt, let's not forget whatever solution that we're coming up has to also negotiate so that these countries can have a balance sheet and are allowed to go back into the market and borrow. And however they agree on the debt relief will impact their future borrowing ability. So what are we doing to help with that as well as part of the total solution?
Thank you all. And as we've mentioned, these are issues that the Bretton Woods Committee's Sovereign Debt Working Group will be tackling in the months ahead. I'd like to now go to Takatoshi Ito. Taka, would you please go ahead and pose your question?
Thank you. This is Takatoshi Ito, SIPA, Columbia University, and I was a member of G20 Eminent Persons Group. And I have a question on the how to internalize the externalities in the infrastructure projects. And so the infrastructure, as you know, the benefits go far beyond the direct user of the completed projects. For example, the railroad projects and riders and freight shippers get benefits, but you know, real estate around the stations and less emission of CO2 and all other benefit to the society, but they are not paying for it. So classical solution in economics textbook, which I teach, is tax, right? So tax the beneficiaries, and then you can internalize and benefits and pay for it, and pay to the private investors or the Bretton Woods institutions loans. But nowadays, government doesn't want to raise taxes, and they want the private sectors to do the jobs on BOT or something else. But that bounds to be a resulting in the underinvestment. So what is a modern solution of this internalizing the externalities? Very classic problem, but you guys must have some modern solution to this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Afsaneh, you want to go first?
I'm so glad, Takatoshi, you asked this question. I meant in my answer when I talked about Bretton Woods institutions to also remind us those institutions, and as Jérôme said, all multilaterals, but you know, speaking again for at least starting with the World Bank, but going to all the others working together, if they are providers of global public goods, you put your finger on it. We have to move from the word externality, because when we were taught in economics, right, as economists, we were taught, you know, air and water and various things are external. And so we used methods like shadow pricing to measure their value, right? So as you said, these institutions, and I should work with economists to remove the word externality from our jargon, because that is part of the problem. They're not external. In fact, they are very internal and they're very important, as you just pointed out. And so I think, for example, it's very interesting in the current new Biden plan, the idea is to remove the subsidies that are given to oil and gas, right? There are still subsidies being given to coal industry in some countries. So if we start removing the subsidies before we even talk about additional taxes, that would be huge, right? In terms of go back and see where we're subsidizing labor, subsidizing production, subsidizing other parts in the food chain that is producing CO2, and then start with that. And then, as you said, go on to see how do we improve the world. I think the youth, which is the people you're teaching, are going to require us, the planet they're living on, they want to make sure it's no worse than the planet we're living on. And I think if we could start removing the word externality and work with all the famous economists who are going to get the next Nobel Prize, that would be the first step.
Thierry, Jérôme?
I mean, in many instances of very practical cases, these so-called externalities are part of the long-term growth of the country, whether it's savings from some actors that then gets reinjected in the economy, or the government's having higher real estate taxes because an area is being developed or whatever. And once you're able to quantify that, we've seen many projects where governments were able to provide what I call transition subsidies to developing projects. When Poland 20 years ago was building the road from Warsaw to Berlin, which was a big thing at the time, they provided a short-term guarantee because Poland was just entering the EU, it was an accession country. because they knew that building that axis for logistic would have been fundamental, but no real investors was willing to take the full traffic risk on this. And the government provided at the time a partial guarantee on the debt for a certain period of time, saying, you know, I will benefit from this because I can quantify what that means for my economy. And therefore, I monetize the support in the form of a guarantee. But it could be a subsidy as well. And so in many cases, I think we've been able over the past decades to monetize these externalities and basically have them been government being the beneficiaries, at least on behalf of all the other stakeholders, that eventually gets taxed. That's them providing that monetization. It's not the only way, but many of those projects have worked that way.
I would just add, I think you need to improve transparency. The public sector needs to think like a private sector. They need to internalize the costs. Fact is, inaction on the climate change front, it's a cost, it's a liability, it's a contingent liability. It will increase the future GDP shortfall. So I think it should be part in terms of how the government accounts for it. The question is, what does it mean for multilateral development banks or for the OECD? I think they should factor into the forecasts. That would be super powerful. And I will stop here. Thank you.
And Emily, if I can just add one point to that.
Final word, yep.
Yeah, there's a similar story to how the British East India Company helped finance the railroad system in India, which is that they gave a 5% return guarantee to any investor who is willing to invest in the railroad system. And if the project returned over 5%, you split the difference. And if it was under 5%, the East India Company made you whole at 5%. And this, in modern parlance, created a lot of white elephants. A lot of these projects, you know, were railroad projects that didn't really work out. But 100 years later, anyone who's worked in India or knows the country would agree that India would not be the country that it is today without a functioning railroad system that required just development banking concepts like guarantees to get off the ground. So I think that it's a wonderful way to end this discussion, because it is why we need the Bretton Woods organizations and their toolkit in large scale. So I just needed to add that history lesson, and then I'll hand it back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Aniket, for putting that nice bow on this conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to more audience questions. We did have many, and many people want to make sure that they can watch a recording of this, which will be on our website. So I want to thank our expert panelists today. This was a fascinating conversation. And as I said, we could not have asked for a better set of speakers to address this topic. So thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank our audience for joining us all week long for our annual meeting. I want to thank our sponsors one more time, SICPA, Morgan Stanley, and Standard Chartered. And I hope that we will get to actually see you all in person in October for the IMF World Bank meetings and for our Bretton Woods Committee International Council. So hopefully we will see you then. Thanks again, everyone. That'll do it for this year's annual meeting.
Thank you
so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.